Hey, this is Andrew from AJS Woodworks, and in this video I'm going to be replacing the 6-speed manual transmission on my 2004 Honda Accord. This will be the same procedure for the 2003 through 2007 Honda Accord, same for the coupe and for the sedan. So the reason that I'm replacing my transmission, probably never should have had to replace it, but I took it to Midas to get my transmission fluid changed. They tightened the drain plug too tight and it cracked my transmission, and they put a thicker fluid in there so that it would drain out over a longer period of time instead of immediately. So a week later, I was stranded on the side of the road with a seized transmission. Of course, they wouldn't do anything about it, claimed it was my fault, and so I'm gonna just go ahead and replace it myself. I'm gonna try to replace it through the top of the engine bay instead of taking out the bottom, so I don't have to take off the subframe, but we'll see how that goes. So let's get started. Before I get into anything, all of the parts and tools that you need will be linked in the description below. The first step is to disconnect the battery, which I have already done here. I disconnected the negative cable. This piece here for me is already disconnected. It's been disconnected in the past and never put back correctly. So this will just pull out for me, but it does have a couple little clips on there that you can just pop out. Then we'll just remove the positive cable. Next, you'll want to remove the front grille cover, and for that you'll just need a flathead screwdriver or a specialized automotive tool. You're just going to take out these plastic clips. So you just pry up on the top, and then they pop out like this. These things are going to be prone to break. I won't be surprised if a few of these break off while I'm taking them out, but you can always buy replacements for them. So there's two of these little clips, one on each end of the grill cover there, and these, all you have to do is pry them out and pull them out. They're a little hard to pull out, but they don't have any special clip on them or anything. Then you can just remove the cover. Now you're going to take a 10mm deep socket and loosen up the battery holder. Then to take it out, you just want to lower the hook down there, turn it to the side so it comes out of the hole, and then you can simply lift it out. It comes out like this. Hopefully yours looks better than mine. Then you can lift your battery out and your battery tray. So now this may be different for you if you have your stock air cleaner in place, but I have a cold air intake installed. So what you'll want to do with your stock air cleaner is basically remove it from the throttle body using undoing the clamps, undoing the tubes that are connected to it, and then you will basically unbolt it from where it's connected. I believe it's connected down there just like my air intake, and it may have one other connection on it, possibly right there, but regardless, I'm going to remove my air intake, and so I'm going to remove the bolt down there and loosen the clamps on the throttle body so that I can remove it. And of course, always remember to wear gloves. I'm bad about that, but it helps with cleanup and it helps you from getting harmful stuff on your skin. Next, you want to remove the battery base. Just remove these bolts here. These are 12mm. You can then remove this bolt here to remove the bracket using a 10mm socket. Then you can go underneath and remove the two bolts that are holding the pan on. So it would be that bolt there and that bolt there. This bolt was a little harder to get to just because I couldn't fit a breaker bar in there. So once you loosen up the 2 bolts down there, this plate will actually slide off because it's really just clamped on, just slides onto the bolts. You don't have to take the bolts completely out. Next, we're going to remove the bracket off of the slave cylinder. As you can see, it's this bolt right here. You just need a 12mm socket for that. And then that will allow this bracket to come off. We can then remove the other bolt that's right next to it there. And that should help us remove the slave cylinder completely. Then we can remove the slave cylinder, being careful not to bend the clutch line. Now we're going to come up here to the fuse relay box and remove this nut. It's a 10mm. And remove this bolt here, which is also a 10mm. You also want to remove this 10mm bolt here. Now you just want to keep disconnecting the electrical connections to the fuse box until you can get some more room to work. Keep disconnecting things here. There's another 10mm bolt on a bracket. So in order to disconnect the positive terminal from the car, you just want to go ahead and get a 12mm socket and disconnect it from the starter here. If you pull this tab, it'll slide off the bracket. Just continue to remove the connections. Unfortunately, there's about 1,000 of them, just to get the wiring harness disconnected. So a couple of really important bolts to remove are that one there. You can see it's disconnected already. And this one here, which this bracket came off of. So remove that one and remove this one. And then this piece here, as part of the wiring harness, will be able to move much more freely. You can get it off the top of the transmission. All right, so now we're disassembling the wiring harness from the relay box. In order for it to get out of the way, you kind of have to disconnect a few things. This here goes here, this plug here goes here. They each have a little tab that you can just press on and pull out, just like that. All right, so now we're just gonna go ahead and drain the radiator so that we can remove these tubes here at the top. And you will want to find your drain plug on your radiator, which is that white plug right there. Just unscrew that and then drain out your radiator fluid. All right, now we're gonna disconnect the coolant reservoir. There's just a small bolt right here that you have to get to. And you can just remove the reservoir. And I undid this small tube here at the top. You really just have to pull it off. It comes off really easily from right here. Next, you can remove this plastic cover. It just has these 2 little plastic screws. Just turn them and pull it out. I have a zip tie on one side because this screw broke off. And then we can remove this rail and get this wiring connection for the coil packs out of the way. That is a 10mm bolt. Pop that one clip out, and then this is a little bit looser. We should be able to maneuver it a little bit better in the future. Then we'll come down here to the transmission itself, where there are a couple clips attached. We're gonna go ahead and remove those. And then there's one down here as well. So we can just take those off. Now we're gonna remove this bolt to remove the starter and starter motor. And that's gonna be a 17 millimeter. You will need to remove this connection here. Basically, there's a little clip in there that comes off right here. And then you can remove the complete starter motor. Removing some more connections off of the transmission. It's able to unclip this part here from there. So now we're able to get this completely free, and that frees up the rest of our wiring harness a little bit more. So now we're going to remove these radiator hoses. Alright, now we're going to start to remove connections off of the intake manifold. We're going to need to do this if we're going to try to replace the transmission from above. Otherwise, there's no need to remove the intake manifold. That should be all the connections off of the intake manifold, and now we can start removing the bolts from the top. So we'll just go ahead and start removing them. They're 10 millimeters. These two radiator hoses. There's a connection here with an O-ring basically around that pipe there, around this. And basically you just have to pull straight off because the studs that are on there, you have to slide over the studs, and then that O-ring holds on pretty tight there in this hole. So just pull straight out and you should be able to get it. Then you can go ahead and remove the gasket. And you're probably gonna wanna get new ones. Now we're gonna need to remove this bracket to give us some room. Set that aside. Then we can remove the pins off of the shift cables. We can now pull the washers off of the top and save these for later. Then we can go ahead and loosen the bolts that are holding the shift linkage on. So there's one here, there's one back here. So you can see that back right there. And there's one down here. Now we're going to remove the rest of these lines here off of the transmission. Just used a 10 millimeter. All right, now we're going to take off just this fan. There's no need to worry about the fan next to it over here, but this one might get in the way of taking out the transmission, so I'm going to go ahead and take it off. And that just requires a 10 millimeter socket. So I took the two top bolts off of the fan. Now I'm going to take the two bottom bolts off. And actually, these two bottom bolts don't even have to be removed completely. The fan can just sit on top of them. So they just need to be loosened. Then you can pull up your fan and it should be plugged in. And then to remove the plug, after you've unplugged it, just squeeze the back end there and it'll pop out. And then you can completely remove the fan. All right, at this point we have the transmission clear from above, so we can go ahead and start jacking up the car. Alright, now I have the vehicle jacked up with a reasonable amount of space underneath it to get underneath it. And now we can take off the front wheels. So in order to get the axle nut off, you see here it's pressed in to that groove on the axle. So you actually have to, I'm going to use a screwdriver, just put it there and then use a mallet and pry that out, and then we can loosen the axle nut. Now we can start disassembling some of this wheel assembly so that we can take the axle out. Go ahead and take this one off as well. It's also a 10 millimeter, just like the other two. Now we need to take this pin out. Now, I wasn't able to catch this on camera, but in order to loosen this, you just tap this joint here with a sledgehammer. You can see it pops out like that. This one here, you should not have punctured this seal here. That's packed with grease. I'm gonna have to get a new one. But on the other side, I popped it up with a sledgehammer and it came out very easily. Now we need to get the splash guard off, and in order to do that, there are some plastic attachments there across the bottom and the wheel well. So we'll go ahead and take those. This jack will support the transmission, and then you want to separately support the engine on this side because you have to take off one of the engine mounts, and so I have a bottle jack supporting that. Alright, so a few areas where I ended up running into some trouble. I ended up taking off the rotor. You don't have to do that, so I didn't show doing that, but you do need to remove this linkage, that one, and that one. And they all come off the exact same way. They just take a lot of work to get moving. So that is something that I didn't get to show. I will show reassembling it, so you can skip to that part of the video if you want to see how they go together, and that will show you how they come apart. But just know that you do need to remove those connections. Now, in order to remove the drive shaft, as you can see here, I have my drive shaft pulled out. That was difficult. You have to pull it out from the transmission side there. You have to come up through that hole there next to the subframe and pry it off, and it took a little bit of prying, but you can tap it with a hammer too, and it eventually came loose. You remove that, wrap it up in a plastic bag, keep it from getting dirty, and then come around to the other side. Now this axle was a little bit more difficult to get. This is the longer axle. It includes the intermediate axle as well. So this one is actually bolted in. So some of the differences here, you actually have to unbolt these 3 bolts here, which I have slided over, but they actually mount right in there, if you can see that. So you remove those 3 bolts. In order to do so, you actually have to remove the heat shield, which is usually right here, unless you want to try to remove your exhaust. I tried to remove my exhaust and the bolts just sheared off or stripped, and I didn't want to have to cut those off. So if you don't want to remove your exhaust, then you can remove this heat shield here, and there's another heat shield underneath here as well, that one there, and then you can remove the bolts that you need to remove, or you can remove this front pipe here and get much more access. But once you do remove those 3 bolts on the axle will easily pull out. You of course don't want to pull on this section because you could break the oil seal. So always pull on a more solid section there. After that, you can start to remove the transmission itself. So I took the bump stop off of here, basically just 2 17mm bolts there. That's a really simple thing to remove. And then you can see the engine mount and transmission mount in one. So you'll need to remove that. And then you also have these 2 top transmission bolts here that you'll need to remove. This mount here, transmission mount bolt down here. These 2 mounting bolts here, and this bolt down here. And then you also need to remove these 2 bolts here, so that one and that one. You also have the clutch cover that you have to take off. That disconnects right there. I got 1 bolt out over there, and now I'm gonna get the second one right there. And that's gonna be a 14mm. Now I'm going to remove this nut here, which is attached to the transmission mount. That way we can just get that transmission mount out of the way. And we'll actually need to remove this one as well, which is also a 14mm nut. So the transmission is unbolted. I have it now hooked up and ready for the engine hoist to pull it out. I've also gone ahead and taken the clutch off, which is really simple. Basically, you just have some bolts here. There's 6 of them, and it's just bolted to the front there. You just undo those. It does take a 12-point socket. I believe it's a 10mm, but I'll make sure that's correct. And you just unbolt the clutch, slide that off. It gives a little bit more room for the transmission to come out. And then what I'm gonna do is take the flywheel off. That will allow the transmission to come out. And I'm getting the flywheel off without the ring gear holder by using a pipe, which I have wedged up into the teeth of the flywheel. It does have plastic on the end of the pipe, so it's not just metal on metal, and that is allowing the flywheel to stay still while I undo it. And it is a 17mm socket. So we have the flywheel off, and now you can see we have a significant amount of space there where we can maneuver the transmission, get it away from this edge here of the frame, and hopefully get it out and get the new one in. Alright, so what we're going to do now is prep the new transmission for install. So what we need to do is get some high temperature urea grease and grease down all the contact points. I'm using this Lucas Oil polyurea grease. We're just going to use a little bit on each contact point. We don't need to use a ton because a little bit goes a long way. Now I went ahead and got a brand new release bearing. What you want to do with your old one to see if it's still good is rotate this here. If you hear any loud noises or it doesn't rotate easily, then you need to replace it. I went ahead and just got a new one to replace my other one because it's pretty old. So you just want to take that and slide it onto your shift fork there. And then you can take that assembly, slide it over the spline, and then that will slide into place there. Basically what I didn't show was just the maneuvering it, just to line it up and get it to where all the bolts lined up and both of the dowel pins lined up. After that, hand tighten all the bolts. So I hand tighten these and the one down here, and then the ones down at the bottom there. And then you can go ahead and go around on all of those and tighten them down tightly. Next, I put on this mount. So it takes 4 bolts there on all 4 corners, 1 bolt here in the end of this mount, and then 4 bolts, 2 on the engine side, 2 on the transmission side. And now the transmission is completely attached to the engine and completely secure on that side. So now we just need to attach all of the mounts on this side. The long one, this bolt goes through here. Then the short one goes right here. Then it takes 2 short bolts to get this one. Next, we need to get our axles on, and we can just insert that into the differential. That inserts very easily. Now, in order to fully seat the drive shaft, simply line up the drive shaft like this, press inward, and hit the end of the drive shaft with a rubber mallet, and it will easily slide into the differential. I now have the intermediate shaft inserted into the transmission. I just need to do the same thing on this side, where I straighten out the shaft and then hit it with a rubber mallet. Now I can put in the intermediate shaft bolts. So there's 2 of these, and they go into that rusted brown bracket there and hold the intermediate shaft. Actually, there's 3 of them, sorry, and they hold the intermediate shaft in place. So we'll go ahead and put those in. And the 3rd intermediate shaft bolt looks like this. It doesn't have the smooth bulge here, it just has a smooth section. So now I'm underneath the vehicle putting on the heat shield for the drive shaft and for the back side of the cat. This shield here has a bolt there, bolt here. This shield here has a connection there and on the other side over there as well as this point there. So we'll go ahead and put those on. Can I put that on? All right, now we got that tightened up. we can go ahead and hit this back in. Now we can go ahead and start putting this back on. This also requires a 17mm socket. Sometimes you have to apply pressure to the top here so that the bolt itself doesn't spin. All right, I have the transmission in, and I have basically everything on the front end assembled, so I have it back on the ground now. It was kind of difficult at a few points to get this back together, just because of the car being as old as it is, and a little bit of rust and old bolts. So getting that joint back together was a little bit of a pain because the bolt inside of the upper ball joint wanted to spin. Didn't have that issue on the other side, so must have just had some bad threads or something like that in the ball joint, but I was able to get it back together. And of course, just assembling everything there on the knuckle and on the brake rotor and getting all that back together wasn't too bad. Of course, just put those 2 bolts on the back side of the rotor back in to put the rotor back on, and then connected all of the brake lines back onto the knuckle, as you can see there on the side. And assembling things, reassembling things, I'm gonna start by putting this fan back on here, and then we're gonna focus on getting everything attached to the transmission, because that is the lowest part of the reassembly process, and then we'll work our way up. All right, so for the fan, like you saw when we removed it, there's 2 little hooks at the bottom. Those just sit into these bolts down here at the bottom. And of course, we do need to plug this back in, so the plug is down here on the bottom, and we'll just slide that back into place. Now we're gonna go ahead and reattach slave cylinder. So you just need to use these bolts here, and it takes a little bit of pressure to compress the slave cylinder, but these are the bolts that you use here. This little bracket here, and we're just going to tighten this down. Make sure this cable here stays nice and steady. Here. Helps a lot to keep, once you remove something, to put the bolt back where it was, and just kind of put it in lightly, that way you don't lose your spot. Now we'll go ahead and put the bolts back into the shift cable apparatus here, and there are 3 bolts that go with that. All right, so you just want to assemble the fuse box like this. You have this big chunk of colorful wires coming out this side, and then you have this cable here and this one coming out this side, and then you should be able to mount it up. But first, you want to remember to mount this bracket. So it pressed over the O-ring now, and now we can tighten up the bolts and nuts. So there are 4 nuts, and they go on this stud, this stud down here at the bottom, and this stud under here. And then we have our 2 bolts, so we'll go ahead and put those in. One goes here at the end of the water passage, and the other goes down here at the bottom of the water passage. Then you'll just want to use a 12mm socket to tighten them all up. Now we'll put in our starter. Now, one important step when putting the shift linkage back together is to apply some high temperature urea grease to this area here of the shift linkage. Then you can put your washers on. Alright, now for this bracket here that holds one of the lines, it takes 2 of these bolts. So we'll go ahead and screw those in. Now we can plug in some of the wiring harness. This gray plug here goes right here. This short one goes right here. And then this long one goes down on the plug on the bottom of the transmission. This tab here plugs into your starter. So in order to connect this main piece of the wiring harness, there are 2 bolts on the top of the shift linkage mount, and one of them is the one here, and it goes into this bracket here. And the other is this one here, and this negative or ground cable attaches underneath it. And then you'll also mount this bracket here on this bolt. Now you can clip in some of the parts of the wiring harness. So this will go here. This one will go here. This small connector will go here. So one thing you actually have to do, and I actually forgot to do it, this cable has 2 brackets on it, and one of those brackets goes on the slave cylinder. So we actually need to loosen that so that we can put that bracket underneath the bolt. And then this cable comes up to here, and then we actually mount it to the side of the engine with this bolt. This little piece there will slide into this here. That clips on nicely. Then we have this plug here, which will then plug into here. Now you can slide all these connections in on their respective tabs. So this one will go here. Lock into place, and then this one will slide in here. keep them all out of the way of the shift linkage. This one will go here. When plugging in this cable here, you actually wrap it around, connect this tab to here, connect the connector there, and then you can connect this tab here. And this one here. Now we can connect the positive harness, which has a connection to the starter. So take off this nut and washer. And then we can cover it with our little rubber cover here. All right, so I have all of the clamps backed off of the ends. That way we can slide them on easily. This long hose here will go down underneath the fan and connect there. And then it will slide onto here. This one will slide onto here. And then it will attach onto the radiator here. So we can just lower this onto the top of the engine, lining up our two studs. Now it's completely seated here on top of the engine. We have all the bolts lined up, and now you can go ahead and start putting these in. I have all the bolts here. I just left them in when I took it out. That way I didn't lose them. You can shift it around until they line up with the holes underneath, and then go ahead and start tightening them up. I'm gonna use this 12mm socket here, and I'm just gonna get them to where they are down close to being snug, but not quite there. And then I'm going to torque them in a crisscross pattern. Now you also have these two nuts that go on, and they just go on the studs. So one in the front here, and this one off in the back. Here we have the torque wrench set up and ready to go at 16 foot-pounds. So let's go ahead and tighten it up. All right, now we'll put the top plate back on, and you can put your bolts back in. Putting this back on, you can slide this tube here back on, and as well as its clamp. You can also put the rail in now, so take the bolts out of where I had them place holding. All right, now you can put on your upper transmission mount. $14mm bolts. Now we can put the coolant reservoir on along with the bracket using this bolt. And then you can attach the hose at the top of the coolant reservoir. All right, now you want to put the plastic cover back on your engine. Reminder that you should have another plastic screw on that side. Mine is just broken off. Then you can go ahead and put your drain plug back into your radiator. And that will be down here, right in front of the engine mount. Your radiator drain plug is also accessible from this little hole here. All right, now we can install the battery tray, which requires these bolts here up at the top. All right, now we can put the air intake back on. Now we can put on the front plastic cover. And because I had to drain the coolant to take off all the radiator hoses, I'm gonna go ahead and fill it up now with new coolant. Now we're gonna put on this bracket on the battery base. Now we can put the battery tray back in, which is lined up with this little knob in this hole. And then you can clip the wiring harness onto the tray.